There's a superpower that the early church had that changed the world. And the superpower is the gospel transforms people. The gospel transforms people. Like, you notice that when people became Christians in the early church, there was no QR codes, no sign-ups, no joining next steps regarding our Connect cards, right? People didn't join the church, or they didn't subscribe or like us on YouTube and follow us on IG or whatever, right? Like, they didn't join a movement. Instead, when people became Christians in the early church, they just were transformed, right? And they just literally just became members of the church. And this superpower has continued to this day as we're seeing lives transformed for the glory of God. And so this afternoon, we're going to look at probably one of the most profound and incredible transformation that happened in the book of Acts, okay? And that is the Apostle Paul, okay? His name was Saul, but then he changed his name to Paul, like some of our members named Tin changing his name to James, right? Right? Like he changed his name from Saul to Paul. Okay, so we're going to read his testimony, and we're going to, if you can stand to join me in reading God's word together, we will. We're going to be turning all the way to Acts chapter 26. So we literally went from Acts chapter 1 through like 7, and now we're jumping towards the end. Okay, Acts chapter 26, towards the end of the book of Acts, and we're going to read Paul's testimony as he shares about his transformation before he was going to be sent to Rome to be put in prison, which is where the book of Romans begins right afterwards, actually. So here's the transition point between the two. Acts 26, verse 12 to 18 reads, "In this connection, I journeyed to Damascus with the authority and commission of the chief priests. At midday, O king, I saw on the way a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, that shone around me and those who journeyed with me. And when we had all fallen to the ground, I heard a voice saying to me in the Hebrew language, 'Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads.' And I said, 'Who are you, Lord?' And the Lord said, 'I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But rise and stand upon your feet, for I have appeared to you for this purpose, to appoint you as a servant and witness to the things in which you have seen, and to those in which I will appear to you, delivering you from your people and from the Gentiles, to whom I am sending you, to open their eyes so that they may turn from darkness to light, and from the power of Satan to God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and a place among those who are sanctified by faith in me.'" That is the word of the Lord. You may be seated. All right. This is Paul's testimony. He actually shares it 3 times in the book of Acts. In Acts chapter 9, in Acts chapter 22, and now in Acts chapter 26, to 3 different groups of government bodies. And he's sharing to people why he became a Christian. And you're going to see here 4 things from this text regarding gospel transformation and what you need to kind of recognize in your life. First, according to Paul, transformation is necessary. That when you become a Christian, there has to be a transformation in your life. It's necessary in your life. Okay. Oops, my bad. Go back. Okay, transformation is necessary. Right? Verse 14, when they're saying, "Saul, Saul." So who is Saul? Right? You remember who is Saul in the text here? Well, Saul is probably the most religiously moral person you could find. Okay? In fact, Saul would describe himself as the Hebrew of Hebrews, and he's righteous to all the law. And yet, he needed to be transformed by the gospel. And if he needed to be transformed, we should consider that we need to be transformed as well. And because oftentimes in the church and in our world, I'll hear people say things like this. I'll hear people say like, "Oh, like the most important thing in life is to live a moral and decent life." You guys ever heard of that? Like, have you ever heard someone telling you that growing up? Like, hey, most important thing is to be a moral and decent life, right? Or someone even telling you like, hey, that's what it means to be a Christian. To be a Christian means to live a moral and decent life. Okay, newsflash. That is the total opposite of what it means to be a Christian. The total opposite of what it means to be a Christian. Because think about this. Nobody lived a more moral life than Saul. I mean, in fact, he's the poster child of a moral and decent life, right? In fact, Saul was part of the Judaism party where they were so strict with the law they would literally follow every single command in the Old Testament, and then Saul would even tell you, hey, I did that perfectly, and I'm all righteous and blameless. But even though you see that Saul was so moral, he was so committed to his religion, he lived a really generous and a really, really good life, he still needed to be transformed. You see that? Or I'll hear people say things like, well, maybe it's not about living a moral, decent life, but maybe it's, oops, I don't have it here for some reason. Okay, it doesn't matter what you believe as long as you believe it with all your heart. I don't have that slide. It doesn't matter what you believe as long as you believe it with all your heart. Have you heard that? Okay, critical thinking time. That is probably the worst philosophy you can live by because it's inconsistent, right? Think about this. Hitler really, 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 really believed in what he believed in, and he was totally wrong, and he got a bunch of people killed in the process. So no, right? Faithfulness does not justify your belief. And a side point here, that's why in the resurrection, Paul says, dude, Christians would be utterly dumb if the disciples died for something they knew to be false. Right? It would be utterly dumb for all of them to die for that, right? And Saul himself in his testimony is sharing like, hey, Saul believed in something with all of his heart, but he was wrong. And therefore, some people were killed. And that's what he's sharing here in his testimony. He says, in this connection, I journeyed to Damascus with the authority and commission of the chief priests. What was he commissioned to do? If you notice, Saul was commissioned to go to arrest Christians, to put them in jail and sentence them to death. That's what he was on the way to do. That was his job. He strongly believed in his righteousness and in Judaism and all that he did. And yet, he was wrong and people died for it. Think about the scenario, okay? Imagine two people, we're going to Tahoe, two of you guys, trying to cross a frozen lake. I don't know where that story came from. Somebody saw a frozen lake in their journey. Right? Two people trying to cross a frozen lake. One person is walking on the side of the lake, and the lake looks really, really, really thin. But he's really confident. He's like, yeah, I believe this lake is going to hold me. And so in confidence, he's like, I got this. He goes. I totally trust the lake. Totally trust it. The other person, right, is walking on the frozen lake, and yeah, the lake looks really, really thick and really, really strong, but he's scared. He's like, I don't know if I can really cross this, right? So he kind of goes very carefully. Question, who lives and who dies in this scenario? The first one lives? Actually, no. The first one dies. The one with the greater faith dies. You notice that? Because he's in confidence, but the ice was really thin. Versus the person who's scared with very little faith, but the ice is thick, he lives, right? Because here's the point of this lesson here. It's not really about the amount of faith you have. It's really about the ice, right? And the same is true for us. It's not really about the amount of faith you have. It's really about the object of faith that you're putting your faith in that matters, right? It's really about what you believe in and what you're going to put your weight in as the cornerstone of your life. It doesn't matter how confident you are. If what you're putting your confidence in is false and shaky, it's not going to hold, right? It's not about your faith. It's really about the object of your faith. So just because everyone believes with all their heart that it's all about doing a good job and it's all about finding the right person and it's all about like getting a nice career, just because everyone strongly and really, really believes that and everyone tells you that, doesn't necessarily mean that that's not shaky ground. Doesn't necessarily mean that that's solid ground. And so even if you grew up in a religious setting, you grew up in the church, you still need to be transformed by the gospel. Right? Paul was moral. Paul was faithful. He grew up in the church as well. He grew up in the whole synagogue. He believed in his religion. But even he needed to be transformed. And that's the same for you and I. So sometimes I'll hear people in church say, well, I've always been with God. Like, I hear that from people. Like, they'll tell me, like, I'll ask people, like, how's your Christian life going? And they'll tell me, well, I've always been with God. But in the back of my mind, what's going through my mind is, okay, that's great. But have you been transformed, though? Or I'll hear people say, oh, I go to church every Sunday. Okay, that's great, but have you been transformed? Oh, I serve in the church. I worship in the team. I help out in the church a lot. That's great. But the question is still, have you been transformed? Have you been transformed? Transformation is necessary for the Apostle Paul, no matter how good or faithful he was. Transformation is necessary for each and every one of us. So then how do you know if you've been transformed? Well, here is the second point. How do you know you're transformed? Transformation means to have your spiritual eyes open. Right? It means to have your eyes open to new realities. Look at Apostle Paul's experience. Verse 16 goes, but rise and stand upon your feet, for I have appeared to you for this purpose, to appoint you as a servant and witness to the things in which you have seen me, and to those in which I will appear to you, delivering you from your people and from the Gentiles, to whom I am sending you to what? Open their eyes, so that they may turn from darkness to light, and from the power of Satan to God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and a place among those who are sanctified by faith. So in other words, to be transformed means to have your eyes opened from blindness. It is to have a new vision, right? This sermon series that we've been going along actually had two meanings this entire time. The first really was about the early church and what it was to, can we envision our church being like the early church and what they believe? But really, secondly, and more subtly and more secretly, and I've saved it for this sermon, is because I've actually been praying that as you're going through the series, that your spiritual eyes will be open, that you'll be moved from darkness to light, that you would experience gospel transformation as you study the early church, that you would have new vision. So here's how you know if you've been transformed, if your eyes are opened. You finally realize that you've been blind all along. Because the reality is, only when you have sight is when you realize how blind you've been. Right? Think about your dream state. Like when you're dreaming, you don't know that you're dreaming, right? It's only that when you wake up that you realize, oh, I was actually dreaming. But while you're dreaming, you didn't know that you were dreaming. And the same is true for us, right? How do you know if you're a Christian who's actually been transformed by the gospel? Well, a Christian will look back to their past and they'll say things like, my goodness, I was such a fool back then. Oh, I can't believe I used to think about God and Jesus this way. Man, like, I thought I knew, but I really didn't know. Oh man, I was wrong about God. I was wrong about his judgment. I was wrong about his church. I was so blind, right? And if you haven't had that experience, if you've never really looked back in your life and never had that experience of, wow, I was really silly back then, or I can't believe I used to believe in that about the church, then maybe you might still be in darkness. That maybe you might still be spiritually blind to certain aspects of your faith. But to be transformed doesn't just mean that you see your past differently, but to be transformed and have your eyes open means that you're going to see new things also, right? Like when you open your eyes and you can see again, you can see new beauty, new color, new values. In our community group last week, I had briefly shared a little bit about my China missions. So how in grad school, I shared this a little bit. In grad school, Elaine and myself and a bunch of my friends, a few of us PhDs, we took 3 weeks and we spent our own money to go on a mission trip to China. So I dug up some pictures here. This was a long time ago, okay? So that's me in the middle over there. Bo is next to me. He became a Christian around the same time as me. He's a PhD in bioengineering at UC Berkeley, did his master's at Stanford and bachelor's at Stanford as well. Travis, right next to him, the white guy, the only white guy, he was a PhD in engineering, and he did research for the military, creating bugs that can control bugs to move around. And he built these little mini robots that go on grasshoppers, and he controls them, and they'll put cameras on them. So he does secret military work. Wesley, who was my roommate, he has a PhD in chemistry, and when COVID first broke out at the Zuckerberg Hospital, the first tests was sent to him in his lab, and he did the research for COVID, the very, very first one from Seattle. So these were all my roommates and housemates, and we were all PhDs at Berkeley at the time, and we all took 3 weeks off in China doing China missions. And to a lot of the world, and for a majority of like our professors during that time, and our friends and like our family members, they can't see why anyone would want to do that, because it was a risk. It was a genuine risk, because we would be behind, right? Because some context, like think about this, like when you are behind, like when you go away for 3 weeks from work, you're already behind at work, right? You're trying to catch up on work. Well, it's more so when you're in a PhD program because it's really cutthroat because your funding is based off of that. And so the majority of people couldn't they were like, why would you want to do this? It makes no sense. Why do you want to do this? A lot of our friends and professors were like that. But most people will tell us like, well, just go when you're done. Like, why can't you just go to missions after you're done with your PhD, right? Why don't you just prioritize? But what they don't see, and what our friends and what our family members and what our professors were not seeing, is what they don't see is that they don't see that's exactly what it means to prioritize God. When they say prioritize, that's exactly what it means to prioritize God, right? That the call of Christ comes before our careers. That's what it means to prioritize something, right? But and you think about it, that we were willing to do for God, and what we were doing for God was not anything different what anyone would do in the world for other stuff that they love, right? People are willing to save and take 3 weeks of vacation, right? Knowing that it's going to set them back off work so they can go on vacation all the time. People take 3 weeks off on vacations just to take a break, right? Because they prioritize their health, right? Or their rest. People are willing to put their entire life on pause, move across the country, end relationships just so they can pursue their love or their career all the time. You hear of people leaving their family and moving across countries for a new job, for a new opportunity, all the time. All the time. But we accept that very naturally. We go, oh, good for you. You're pursuing your dream. You're pursuing what you love. That's great for you. But somehow when it comes to what we want to pursue and prioritize God, when we say we want to love God and we start to put things behind for God, all of a sudden everyone's like, whoa, that's kind of weird. Why? It shouldn't be, right? There will always be a risk or a cost to pursue what you love and to prioritize what you love. And as Christians, it wouldn't be surprising for us to be willing to risk our PhDs or a risk well-paying job if it means we get to pursue the God that we love. And then you begin to see the beauty in Pastor Raymond's sacrifice. You begin to see the beauty and you see things differently of why he would make the choice that he makes. And looking back, that trip was the most impactful trip for me. Both myself and Bo, we were brand new Christians at the time, actually, okay? I've only been a Christian for about 3 months at that time. So it wasn't like I knew anything about the Bible or anything, all right? Bo, too, brand new Christian at the time. But that was a life-changing moment for me because that was the moment that picture to the right, I remember driving by and saw these kids playing in that water, and that's when my heart broke, and I said, wow, I want to be able to spend my life serving and loving on people and making a difference in people's lives and really sharing them with the gospel. And that's why I'm here today. It actually started because of this trip, and if I didn't go, I don't think I would have continued to be able to make other sacrifices for the sake of building up the church. And I'm not saying this to make you guys feel bad. I'm just sharing with you guys that it's logical for Christians to put things on pause for God, just like how it's equally logical for anybody to put their families on pause or their jobs on pause to pursue what they love, is my point. And here's the thing, right? Sometimes you have to be willing to make sacrifices. And what you are willing to sacrifice speaks about what you care about and what you actually love. That is the object of your faith. That is your cornerstone. what you're willing to sacrifice for will speak volumes to what actually matters in your life. And so to be transformed by the gospel, to have a new vision means that you begin to see the world and sacrifices and different things and value things very, very differently in light of the gospel. Right? Like I used to value sleeping in the morning. I love sleeping Sunday. I love sleeping in. I used to value sleeping in on Sunday mornings, but now I'm going to wake up early to go to church because I'm sacrificing my sleep for something that I want to pursue, which is what I love. God, I want to show that. I used to value Friday night happy hours. I still do. but now I look forward to my community groups because I want to just hang out with folks, right? I used to value how much I can save in my bank account, but now I value how generous I can be with my bank account. You see, when you have your eyes open spiritually, you begin to see values differently. Things that used to matter a lot, things that used to mean a lot, all of a sudden you see things in the opposite, which might not make sense to people around you. But that's what it means to have your eyes opened, to have a new vision. And so I pray for all of us here that as you've been going through this series, that God will open your eyes to other areas that you may be blind to. I still have my blind spots. Right? We all have our blind spots still. But I pray that God will show you another area to open your eyes to, another value system that's different. You know, we're going to sing Amazing Grace at the end later. There's a line I really love. It says, I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. That's good doctrine. You didn't find yourself. You didn't find God. God found you. It was all God and all grace. You were blind, but now you can see. That was also God. So even if you wanted to, you couldn't. But it's a miracle that it happens. And so if you are no longer blind, if God is showing you a vision for your life, if he's showing you a new vision, if he's showing you other areas, if he's showing you different values, if he's showing you different things, it means that you're being transformed and a miracle is actually happening in your life right now. And that's not guilt. That's not guilt. That's actually a miracle happening if you're beginning to wrestle with what you used to value. Praise God, right? Because it was all his grace, his doing it for his glory. And here's the third and last point. Transformation is a process. It's a process. No matter how sudden it seems, gospel transformation is really a process. Verse 14 reads, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads. Okay, class, what's a goad? Okay, it's not a body part. Okay, so I'm telling you that it's not a body part. A goad was actually a sharp stick that shepherds would use to poke the sheep. Okay, in order for the shepherds to guide the sheep, sometimes sheep might run across the cliff. They might go something dangerous. So a shepherd would have the sharp stick. And so when the sheep is about to do something dangerous, like run off a cliff, the shepherd would literally poke the sheep and it would hurt. But it will also make the sheep turn away and not fall off the cliff and die. Okay, that's what a goad is. It's a shepherd stick to guide sheep. And it would stick them and it would hurt. And Jesus is saying here, Saul, Saul, this is exactly what I've been doing to you over the years. That I've been actually poking you over the years. And I've been guiding you over the years. It didn't just happen on Damascus Road. And this teaches us that transformation doesn't happen like instant noodle. It actually happens through a whole process that God's been actually poking you and prodding you. And sometimes his poking hurts. Sometimes his poking will make you feel very, very uncomfortable and you wouldn't like what you're experiencing a lot. And that's so what's happening in your life right now is part of a process. And maybe Jesus has been goading you. He's been leading you. He's been poking you, directing you. And sometimes it's painful. So how did this happen in Paul's life? You see, Paul's transformation didn't happen on Damascus Road. Paul was actually on a journey. And his journey actually started back in Acts chapter 7, which I didn't preach on. But Acts chapter 7 was when Paul witnessed the death of Stephen, the first martyr in the church. Right? Stephen had been Paul's gold. Now, how do I know this? Because when you read Paul's theology and you read through all his epistles, and then you read Stephen's last sermon before he dies, you're going to notice that a lot of Paul's theology came from that sermon that Stephen preached at the end of his life. Right? There's a lot of overlap. And in Acts 22, as Paul was sharing his testimony to another group, he mentioned Stephen's impact in his life. He said, "And I said, Lord, they themselves know in one synagogue after another that I imprisoned and beat those who believe in you. And when the blood of Stephen, your witness, was being shed, I myself was standing by and approving and watching over the garments of those who killed him." So Paul's revealing his transformation. He says, when Stephen was being killed, I was there and I was part of the people that said, stone him, kill that Christian. That's how much Paul hated Christianity. He actually killed Stephen for it. And Paul vividly remembers that day as he watched Stephen being stoned to death. But it's been poking on his heart, is what he's saying. It's been poking in my heart. Stephen became a gold in Paul's life that was part of a process that eventually broke Paul's hardened heart and transformed him. Do you see how much impact Stephen has on Saul's life? And this is how he did it. If you read Stephen's speech in Acts chapter 7, as he was being persecuted, as he was being stoned to death, pay attention what Stephen did. Pay attention to how he faced death and persecution and how he made such a big impact in Paul's life. So as we read this next passage, you guys be Stephen. So you read the highlighted lines. Okay, so I need you guys to read the yellow part. I'll read all the white parts. Okay, this is Stephen's final speech before he dies. But he, full of the Holy Spirit, gazed into heaven and saw the glory of God and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. And he said, "Behold, I see the heavens opened, and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God." But they cried out with a loud voice and stopped their ears and rushed together at him. Then they cast him out of the city and stoned him. And the witnesses laid down their garments at the feet of a young man named Saul. And as they were stoning Stephen, he called out, "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit." And falling to his knees, he cried out with a loud voice, "Lord, do not hold this sin against them." And when he had said this, he fell asleep. You see, Stephen's death and Paul being a witness to that really impacted his life and became a gold in his life. Because think about this. How does Luke know about this story? Because Luke wasn't there. It's because Paul had told him about this story vividly. That's why Luke was able to record it. Right? Paul is sharing his testimony. He's recording this. Right? So Stephen's death and what he did at his final breath impacted Paul big time. And here's what you and I can do to be Stephens for this generation. When everything else in your life is falling apart, don't you fall apart. When everything else in your life falls apart, don't you fall apart. But instead, look at God. Right? That's what he did. Right? This is a portrait of Rembrandt's portrait. He painted this when he was 19 years old of stoning of Stephen. And you guys know by now, I really like Rembrandt as an artist. And Saul saw that. When everything in Stephen's life was breaking apart, when Stephen was on the crux of dying, he didn't break apart, but he fixed his gaze upon God. And really, guys and girls, there really is no greater proof on this side of the world for Christianity than how you as a Christian can suffer in peace and how you can handle suffering and injustice. There is no greater proof to this world than how you handle your life when your life falls apart. There isn't. So how are you handling your suffering? How are you handling things in your life that's falling apart, that is not going your way? Are you living as if you are loved by God? Right? When you're falling apart, when your life is falling apart, when life gets hard, guess what is showing? Your cornerstone is showing at that point. Your belief, your doctrines are showing at that point. How you respond to suffering and difficulty is revealing what you really believe and what's actually your doctrine in life. What's been your cornerstone in life, right? You're acting like God is not in control. You're acting like God is not for you. You're acting like God is not in your life when life falls apart. That reveals what you really believe. And my plea is when you are suffering, when you're experiencing injustice, look at Jesus, and it can make you an incredible witness, right? Stephen didn't know this at the time because Stephen looked at Jesus, but he impacted Paul big time. And in turn, Paul impacted the entire world. Do you realize most of the New Testament was written by the Apostle Paul? Majority of the books in our New Testament is written by the Apostle Paul. He became an apostle to the Gentiles. And so as we end our vision series, listen, people are watching you now. Your friends, your family members, your coworkers, they are watching you, right? They're watching you how you respond to suffering. They're watching you how you respond to difficulties. They're watching you how you respond to stress. They're watching you what you choose to prioritize. They're watching you what you choose to sacrifice, because that's what's going to reveal your cornerstone. That's going to reveal what you believe, and that's going to reveal your doctrine. And to the degree that you live differently from this world, and you have a different vision and a different value and a different sacrifice system, and to the degree that you make decisions and live in a way that sometimes other people cannot make sense of, that might be the greatest witness of the gospel that you can have in your community. Not your intellect, not how great you can argue Christianity. And who knows, maybe somebody who's been watching your life this entire time might be tomorrow's Paul. And you don't know that. But maybe someone's watching your life right now, and they might be tomorrow's Paul, who will one day might impact the world. And then your life would be a goad that would poke at them and lead them to their Damascus road. And so for some of you, as you're listening today, as we end, today might be your Damascus road. Today might be the day that you realize this entire time I was blind to what I really believed and what I sacrificed for. Like today might be the day that God has been goading you and poking you and leading you to help you see that there are areas of your life that has not been transformed yet. And perhaps today is the day that God is opening his eyes and opening your eyes to your blindness. And if that is the day, I want to encourage you to don't wait another day. Right? Today is the day of salvation. Today can be your Damascus road. Today, if you say yes to Jesus, you know that it just doesn't happen instantaneously. It's been a process. He's been speaking. He's been poking. He's been leading. He's been guiding. And the fact that you're even here today is not an accident.